Welcome to this brief introduction to the Apology of Socrates by Plato. Let's start with those three words: apology, Socrates, and Plato. First, apology. An apology in ancient Greek does not mean "I'm sorry." Socrates, the main speaker in this dialogue, never says "I'm sorry" in his speech. To the contrary, he praises himself. Apology in ancient Greek means a defense speech. The apology is Socrates' defense speech before the jury. It is part of a trial. Socrates is 70 years old, and he is on trial for not believing in the city's gods and for corrupting the young. We learn from the speech itself that Socrates loses this trial. He's found guilty. He is even sentenced to death. After all, ancient Athens was a city where you could be killed for believing the wrong things. Strictly as a defense speech, then, his apology is a failure. Second, the word Socrates. The title is Apology of Socrates. Socrates is the main character in most, if not all, of the dialogues that Plato wrote. But this is the only one in which Socrates' name appears in the title. Now, Plato surely meant something by this. While every dialogue is somehow about Socrates, this one is so especially. Even though it is so public, maybe because it is so public, it is Socrates' defense of his way of life. To defend his way of life means, after all, that he must reveal something about this way of life. Third, then, Plato. This is Plato's Apology of Socrates. Plato himself never appears in his Socratic dialogues, except this one. Socrates twice refers to Plato by name here, as being present in the audience. Now again, in none of the other dialogues does Plato appear. More generally, in none of the other dialogues do we see Socrates, as a mature man, speaking with another philosopher, someone of his own stature. Only here, Socrates' apology stands in for what must have been many conversations that Socrates and Plato had. But how is this a conversation? Does Plato respond? We'll come back to these questions at the end. For now, let's turn to Socrates' apology itself. It falls into three main parts. First, there's Socrates' defense speech proper. This is by far the longest part of the dialogue. This part ends with the jury of 500 Athenians voting to convict Socrates of his crimes. Second is Socrates' proposal of an alternate penalty to death. Because he considers himself such a benefactor to the city of Athens, Socrates proposes that the city punish him by giving him free meals for life. This brief section ends with the jury voting to punish Socrates with death. Third, the last part is Socrates' speech after sentencing, in which he chastises those who voted against him, and he tells those who voted for him to be of good hope about his death. He ends by asking his condemners to make his three sons suffer as he made others suffer, by reproaching them if they care for anything else more than virtue. So that's the big picture. Let's turn back now to the first and longest part, Socrates' defense speech proper. Again, as a purely legal defense, it's a loser. But as a defense of Socrates' way of life, this speech has proven incredibly powerful, leading people to compare Socrates to Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., even Jesus. We would misunderstand the dialogue if we somehow shut ourselves off from feeling that attraction. But we must also ask, what is this philosophical life that Socrates is talking about here? So Socrates' defense proper has two main parts. Each of these parts is followed by a much larger digression. So there's two parts, each followed by a long digression. In the first part, Socrates defends himself from the first accusers, as he calls them. People who have slandered him for years, saying that he was a natural scientist who doesn't believe in the city's gods. Socrates' defense is simple. None of you have ever heard me talking such drivel or teaching it to others for pay. In the digression that follows this first part, Socrates raises a question someone could ask. Well, Socrates, what then is your work, and how did these slanders against you arise? To explain, Socrates tells a story of how one of his companions asked the Delphic oracle if anyone was wiser than Socrates. The oracle answered that no one was wiser. This answer seemed to Socrates to be a riddle, for he wasn't conscious of being particularly wise. So he decided to refute the god. He went to people who seemed wise, politicians, poets, and craftsmen, and interrogated them about their wisdom. he found that they all claimed to know something noble and good, as he puts it. But when pressed, they turned out not to know, but only to think that they knew. So, since Socrates knew that he didn't know anything noble and good, while these others thought that they knew but did not know, in this little thing, his knowledge of his ignorance of anything noble and good, Socrates concluded that he was indeed wiser. Of course, his interrogations made all these other people angry, and that anger led to the slanders. But, Socrates said, he ran that risk for the god. Now, in the second part of his defense proper, Socrates addresses his present accusers, who are three prominent Athenians, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycos. And he addresses their formal charge that Socrates does injustice by corrupting the young and not believing in the city's gods, but by bringing in new divinities. Now, Socrates' defense in this section amounts to showing that his primary accuser, Meletus, does not know what he's talking about. This is known as an ad hominem defense. Perhaps because he recognizes its weakness, Socrates follows this second part of his defense proper with a second digression. In this digression, Socrates imagines someone asking him, "Well, what have you been up to that has put you at risk for death?" Socrates answers that he is like a soldier on duty, that he's been ordered by the god to philosophize, that is, to reproach the Athenians for not caring more about virtue. Or, as he adds, he is like a horsefly that keeps the large, stupid horse of Athens awake. But since he could never have survived in the rough and tumble world of politics, he has done his duty by improving his fellow citizens in private. Based on the flimsiness of his actual defense, you can see why Socrates was found guilty. Based on these stirring digressions, you can also see why Socrates' apology has attracted generations to philosophy. For the two digressions show the philosopher as not only innocent, that is, just, but also as noble, as standing up for what's right. Far from being an atheist or a corrupter of the young, the philosopher has answered a divine call and he serves the common good. Now, we're skipping over a great deal of complexity here, but at the very least we can conclude that Socrates' defense means to attract to philosophy people who care deeply about virtue and who are open to the possibility of a divine call. Notice, too, that the center of each of the two digressions is a statement from Socrates of what he does not know, of his ignorance. So in the first digression, he says that he does not know anything noble and good. Now that's equivalent to his saying that he does not know what morality is, or even that it is anything at all. In the second digression, he says that he does not know sufficiently about the things in Hades, that is, of death. Now, how Socrates' positive self-description as just and noble relate to these statements of his ignorance about morality and about death, this is the great puzzle of Socrates' life. Perhaps the activity of thinking through that puzzle is what leads Socrates to suggest later in the speech that, quote, the greatest good for a human being is to spend every day making speeches about virtue and such matters, while the unexamined life, he says, is not worth living. But let's close with Plato. I said that this dialogue is the only one we see between Socrates and Plato. But doesn't Socrates do all the talking? Not exactly. In his proposal for an alternate penalty, the second and central part of his entire speech, Socrates says that Plato speaks up. You'll remember that Socrates made the insulting proposal that the city should, so to speak, punish him by feeding him for the rest of his life. He also says that if he had to pay a fine, he could and would pay only a very small one. But then he adds, but Plato here, and several others, have ordered him to pay a fine 30 times greater, which they will guarantee. So was Plato just highlighting himself here as leading an attempt, a doomed but noble attempt, to save his friend and his teacher? Maybe. But maybe there is something more to his appearance at this point. Plato's order to Socrates corrects Socrates. It could almost be seen as a rebuke to Socrates. But doesn't the whole preceding speech show Socrates' justice and his nobility? What then is Plato correcting? Well, that's a question to pursue throughout all the dialogues. Here, I'll only say that Plato seems at pains to show a greater respect for the city's customs and opinions than his teacher does. That's a point for us to consider vis-a-vis our own nations and modern tolerance. For despite his unorthodoxy, Socrates himself never criticizes Athens for being the sort of community that might kill you for your beliefs. Thank you for joining this brief introduction to the Apology of Socrates by Plato.